Hey, what's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and this video tonight is going to be a little different than the ones I usually put out, sort of. This video is going to be a Destruction Warlock what's wrong video. Now, when I say what's wrong, I don't mean the spec is bad or terrible or anything. It is indeed seeing some play in the MDI in certain settings, and we'll discuss all of that. Mythic Plus, rating, single target, AoE, two target, different damage profiles, all of that. But Destruction is performing very poorly in Vault of the Incarnates, but it's currently one of, if not the highest simming single target spec in the actual game, and it keeps receiving more and more buffs in 10.07 and 10.1 multiple times over the course of 10.0.5. Realistically, its damage output in sims, which aren't the end all be all, and just in general in single target, is not the actual issue. So tonight I want to discuss what the general issue, or I guess issues, are with Destruction, get into all that, and maybe have some hope for these changes, or I guess issues to be addressed via changes heading into patch 10.1. Now, as always, week auras, add-ons, profiles, all for free to you guys if you guys would like. Links down below to my Twitch and Discord where you can get them all for free. And as always, I want to give one huge shout out to my patrons where you get too far in the video. Guys, thank you for all supporting on Patreon a million times. I really appreciate it. If you're looking at supporting on Patreon, should be a link up here as well as down below in the video description. If you like the video, hit the like and sub buttons below. It helps out a ton. With that being said, let's just jump right into it. Okay, so I figured the best way to start off here would be to look at some sims. And these are all going to be 5-minute patchwork single target sims from varying specs and classes. Huge shout out to all the people that helped me with it. Tettles, Asuna, Preheat, a bunch of people from Guild. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate all the help, legitimately. Now, I will say off the bat that when it comes to sims, especially single target sims, they are not the end all be all as far as, you know, class performance goes. You might sim high and not perform too well in a certain fight. For example, Demonology is the lowest simming single target spec for Warlock in Vault of the Incarnates. It's probably the most played spec in Vault of the Incarnates for Warlock as well. It sees the most play on Razagath, Broodkeeper, Aranog, Primal Council, because of the damage profile that it has. Good stacked single good single target, stack cleave, solid cooldowns being a minute to a minute and a half. It's just generally very strong. However, Destro sims a good bit higher, but it is seeing very little play in the raid, and typically, even when it comes to that, if you're simming relatively well, for the most part, there's some correlation between simming well, being relatively powerful in sims, and being good in the raid. But Destro does not follow suit with that. So, starting off here, here's our Shadow Priest from our guild. He's a bit unoptimized. He started gearing his character 2 weeks ago. 83,801 DPS. So keep in mind, sims are not the end-all be-all, but I want to make a point with this part of the video. 83,801 DPS. Nobody is playing static empowerment. They're all playing chaos or versatility, whatever. 83.8. Our BM Hunter. 89,000. One of the higher sims that I actually got in here. 89,000 DPS. Moving on to Tettles. 79,374. And a great example here as well. Playing a Boomkin. Not the highest simming spec in a single target, which is not, you know, doesn't say everything, obviously. Not the end-all be-all, but Boomkin is doing very well in Plus and relatively well in the raid as well. Basically 80k. So we have 83.8, 90k, 80k, 89k, whatever we'll call it. 80k. Our Boomkin from raid here, 76,472. We have one of our rogues, 87,630 DPS. Spooky, which is one of our evokers, 85,000 DPS. We have Preheat's evoker, who's EU side, 90,674 with Mythic Stick. He's pretty geared out here as well. A-Train, our Demon Hunter, 87,000 DPS. Asuna, Arcane Sim, 85,000. To be fair, Arcane's a bit weird when it comes to certain damage profiles and things, but 85,000 DPS. Asuna's Frost Sim, 92,000 DPS. Asuna's Fire Sim, 87,423 DPS. Now, I will say my character is not fully optimized either, but we are pretty optimized. Nonetheless, my current sim, 93,632 DPS, and we are indeed playing versatility flash, nothing crazy here. I am ahead of the second highest sim by about, I think, 1,500 DPS roughly, and that is, I don't even know where it went here, 90k Asuna on Frost Mage. Now, if you pull up the overall top gear damage profiles for tier 22, whatever tier we're in now, tier 29, I'm sorry, it does indeed go Frost Mage, Survival, BM, and Holy Elemental, Fire Mage, and then the Enhancement Shaman Gamble build. And for the most part, these classes are known for being pretty strong. Frost Mage, Fire Mage, Illy Shaman, Hunter seeing a bit more play now with the buffs. And Holy is also very strong with their CDs. Destro is here, relatively high as well. You have Evoker being here and everything else. But if you end up pulling up Warcraft logs, it does not look the same. Now, the funny thing is, if you're looking for Destro Lock in Vault Incarnate's like stats representation, you have to scroll all the way down. And we are the lowest class here, below Arcane Maids and Elemental Shaman, yet we are one of the highest simming single target specs in the game, and we're also seeing some play in the MDI in these really heavy AoE settings, which does sort of play into our strengths, but also our weaknesses by a long shot. We'll get to that in a little while. But the big thing here, for being one of the highest simming single target specs in the game, and overall Warlock's highest simming single target spec, ahead of Demo by 15k, ahead of AF by 3 to 4k, it's very surprising seeing Destro Lock this low. Let's be honest, Warlock is down astronomically this tier in general compared to where we've been for the past 10 years, but hey, you know, it is what it is. But even going overall, just filtering by all Warlock specs on every fight, Aranog, Demo, Taros, AF, Demo is a Destro parse here. But Taros is the only patchwork boss this tier in the raid. And you would assume, okay, Destro's the highest simming single target spec by a long shot, by a few thousand DPS. Destro should then theoretically, you know, if you just extrapolate that out, be the highest here. But it's not. It was initially Demo, the early prog. Now it's AF. There are some Destro parses, but they're few and far between. Primal Council has one parse here, which does indeed play into the consistent hard, heavy AoE profile that Destro can bring, sustained AoE, but then it's Demo, then it's AF. Sonarth is all AF with one Destro here. Dathia has some Destro cleave. Whether you're on the main platform or cleaving ads more often than not, there is some here, but Dathia is a bit of a grab bag for Warlocks. If you're playing AF, you're typically just burning the boss down. Demo's terrible here. It's sort of just like a, well, you do what you can in this fight and that's that. And looking at Kurog, this is the one fight Destro has this tier. It is a, for the most part, nearly permanent two-target fight, but you're playing Mayhem on it for the most part, for a lot of RNG when it comes to cleaving. And even if you look at Kurog Grim Totem outside of Warlocks and just pull up general, you know, overall parses, Warlock is not even the strongest class in this fight. There are classes that are ahead of us by a substantial bit. And looking at Destro being the premier two-target cleave spec in the game, how it's been for a long time, it's still very odd, and there are once again reasons as to why Destro is not as strong on Kurog as it may seem, which we'll get into in a minute here. And looking at Brewkeeper and then Razagath, it's basically the same. There are two parses for Destro and Razagath, by the way. This fight is a great example of as to why the spec is not very good right now in a lot of settings. Highest Demo parse being 110, AF being 105. There are two Destro parses, one being 90k, one being, I believe, 65k. It varies a lot, 84k and 65k. Both great players, also just, you know, PIs, and let's be honest, the spec's just not very good in majority of settings currently. So, with all that being said and laid out, I think it's important to highlight Destro's strengths, number one, because there are some. It's seeing some play in the MDI, but then talk about its weaknesses and how they can maybe be changed heading into patch 10.1 in hopes of Destro once again becoming a solid prog spec. Cross your fingers. So, as most of us most likely know, Destruction Warlock is seeing some play in the MDI in high-end key-based settings where you have Algothar's Academies, Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, Ruby Life Pools, places where you're making these very large pools, 10, 15, 20 plus mobs, and you can reach 1 million plus damage as far as DPS is concerned, actually destroying packs just how you were in Season 3 and Season 4 of Shadowlands. Now, a lot of that is due to Madness of the Azakir, our talent. Previously, this was a legendary in Shadowlands, and it only affected Chaos Bolt. This meant that it was an increase in single target, but really didn't impact our AoE. Our AoE was typically just based off of our 2-piece and 4-piece in Shadowlands, which gave us an extra Infernal, more random Chaos value, and all of that. Now, that was nerfed multiple times before, you know, the expansion ended, but they did indeed essentially give us the same 2-piece, 4-piece as a talent or talents in our talent tree. Now, that does indeed help fuel shard generation, but it's nowhere near as strong as it used to be. The main thing that fuels Destro and heavy AoE is the talent Inferno. This talent gives you more shard generation based on the number of targets like Rain of Fire hits, so more shard generation means more Rain of Fire cast, and the more targets you pull means there's more chances for more shard generation. So it's a vicious cycle of casting multiple Rain of Fires. They do indeed stack, so it's more Rain of Fires, more shards, which procs your 2-piece, 4-piece talents, Avatar Destruction, and I believe Chaos Incarnate, over and over for more shards, more Infernals. It's almost the same cycle that we had in Shadowlands. And Madness further amplifies Rain of Fire damage, and that's the big difference that we had one of them at least from Shadowlands. Now, this is why Destro is seeing a good bit of play in the MDI, some play I should say, in keys like Ruby Life Pools, keys like Alcathar's Academy, at times Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, because you're able to pull multiple packs at once, get, you know, really like 8, 9, 10, 12, 14, even in big settings in Alcathar's, 15, 20 plus targets together, AoE them all down, do an absurd amount of damage, and have your Warlock carry your group's damage on that pull, eliminating multiple packs at once, because your Warlock has CDs, he has Infernal, and he can blast everything into the ground. Now, while this is Warlock's main strength in Mythic Plus, it's also one of its biggest weaknesses when it comes to Mythic Plus, because Inferno, as we mentioned, it gains more value. It generates more shards, essentially allowing Rain of Fire to do more damage in these heavy 9, 10, 12 plus target settings. But when you're in settings that have, you know, 3 mobs, 4 mobs, even like 5 or 6 mobs at times where you're pulling 1 pack at a time, essentially, Destro really cannot do a whole lot there. And I think that's one of Destro's first weaknesses, is that it lacks burst AoE. We really don't have anything at all, nowhere near the level of Demonology, going Demonic Strength, Dogs, Implosion, all of that. And realistically, nowhere near Affliction either. They can just spam Seed of Corruption, sow the seeds, and then a bunch of Soul Flame damage. Destruction needs time. It can't go into a pack and burst to 1,000,000 DPS. It takes time getting multiple Rain of Fires down, getting shard generation rolling, getting your Infernal down, going into your Havoc window, generating shards, and building from there. You ramp your damage. So you don't see it a whole lot in lower keys. You don't see it in certain keys like Halls of Valor, for example, because of just the packs being small, not being able to get full value, which is also sort of similar to a handful of fights in the raid. Razageth, for example. Destro's very good at single target damage, but one of the issues is that you don't have really any burst AoE damage. Think of the intermission when there's ads on each platform. What do you do to those ads? You can cast a couple Rain of Fires, but Rain of Fire doesn't do anything on its own. It's very, very slow to ramp up, and when you're killing multiple packs very quickly, moving along, a lot of movement as well, if mobs get dragged out of your Rain of Fire, you really don't do much damage at all. Nowhere near Demonology that can cool down every minute, has Demonic Strength, Implosion, Dogs chomping, Aff can just spam Seed of Corruption, sow the seeds, can just Soul Flame it all down. Destruction's really lacking when it comes to the on-demand snap burst damage department. There is the option of playing Cataclysm over Inferno in certain keys of, I guess, lower pull count, but realistically Cataclysm's not very good as far as burst is concerned. It's more of a utility spell. I wish it was good, but it's just not. So Destro's, one of its more largest issues, and one of the reasons why it sees niche play in the MDI, when it's good in AoE, it's very good. But when it's mediocre, the spec is exceptionally mediocre, because you can't guarantee those 10, 12, 14, 16, 18 mob pulls. Destro then most likely is not the play in those settings. When it comes to more single target based damage, I guess just damage profiles in general, Destruction Warlock, similar to Affliction Warlock, has a very consistent damage profile. And the unfortunate part about that is because, number one, we did indeed lose Dark Soul from Shadowlands in previous expansions. Our only real cooldown at this point is Summon Infernal. And while there are these cool traits below it, like Crushing Chaos, which is an old trait that makes your Chaos Bolts, Rain of Fires, and Shadowburns cost less shards, or Infernal Brand, which makes your Infernals hit harder, essentially, like literally meleeing harder. And below it, you have Reign of Chaos and Grand Warlock's Design. But unfortunately, all these are very underpowered. Sort of underpowered, and you have a lot of other powerful choices over here. But with that being the case, grabbing these traits here means you put 2 points in Crashing Chaos or Infernal Brand, and then a point in Reign of Chaos or Grand Warlock's Design. But when it comes to your other options here, you have double shard generation from Incinerate, you have Madness, which you're not ever specking out of, you have Chaos Incarnate, which is a permanent talent choice everywhere, you have your Ritual of Ruin, Avatar Destruction, and you have Burn to Ashes. Now you have a floater point here, sort of in a sense, when it comes to Master Ritualist, but even if, that's 1 point in which you need 3 to get to Reign of Chaos or Grand Warlock's Design. And even if you're going to Grand Warlock's Design, Infernal with both these traits really doesn't do a whole lot in the first place. Infernal Brand's been nerfed multiple times over and over and over to a point of irrelevancy where it doesn't really do much in general, even if you're playing it with Reign of Chaos. And Crashing Chaos has this odd sequence of cast where your Chaos Bolts basically cost 1 shard, while your Infernal's down, while you have your 2-piece and 4-piece rolling, which is giving you shard generation. So you're overcapping on shards, spamming Chaos Bolts, which means you're overcapping on Burn to Ashes stacks by a crazy amount. And it feels good to cast 6, 7, 8 bolts in a row, but it feels exceptionally anti-synergistic and just not very good when oh, I had these really hard hitting incinerates that hit almost as hard as Chaos Bolt that I'm just overcapping on at 4 stacks max. But getting back into the lack of Dark Soul, lack of relatively impactful CDs, Infernal is just not that impactful. And when it comes to other cooldowns outside of Infernal, we really don't have any. Now, I talked about Destro's lack of cooldowns in the 10.1 feedback video. Other classes have a handful of them, shifting power, this and that, everything else. We don't have Dark Soul. We don't have a button to hit anymore of great relevance to further amplify our damage. Now, when it comes to a progression-based setting, if you have 2 classes that will both do 90,000 DPS over the course of a 5.5 minute fight, but one class has the option of hitting a button and doing twice their damage at a certain point in the fight, that you can allocate to a certain point where you need more damage, where ads are spawning, or you're breaking a shield on a boss, or whatever's happening, 9 times out of 10, the class that can hit that extra button and put out that extra damage will be taken over the class that does a consistent 90k over the course of the entire fight. Now, what I've done here is taken the top Destro single target profile from Taros. It is a 90k parse. They did indeed receive 3 power infusions. The timestamps, find it here, I believe they were 0, 210 roughly, and then 411. But regardless, I want to compare them to 2 other players in their raid who I don't believe received power infusion, but nonetheless, look at the average damage output, their burst, and then where they're sitting over the course of the fight. So this is the Destro parse here. On pull, Taros, Bloodlust, power infusion. Destro burst to about 200k, which is strong, solid, good opening overall burst. Destro with Infernal and Madness. Infernal does bring a bit more shard generation, still not incredibly strong. When you pair Infernal with Bloodlust, with PI, with Madness uptime for a long time, and probably no mechanics on pull on Taros, you can do a good bit of burst. But look at his damage output over the course of the fight besides that. It is very consistent at about roughly, I'd say 80k, dipping a little bit more here, getting power infusion right at about 208. So this peak here is probably like a bit of power infusion-esque stuff. It's sitting roughly at about 75 to 80k, and the overall parse was 90k. There's a bit of a peak here as well. This is going to be second Infernal. And look at how much you peak with Infernal. Averaging at about, I'd say, what, 80k? You peak to a solid 95k, maybe breaking 100k. This is your main 3-minute cooldown. Doesn't feel like a cooldown to me. Like, this is your main cooldown. And this is your main cooldown. Because I can show that he did indeed Infernal at 3 minutes, right? It wasn't a 4-minute Infernal or anything. He Infernaled at 0. Not Soulfire. He Infernaled at 0, and he Infernaled at 301, right? So 0, here's first Infernal. Here's second Infernal. Theoretically, right here, he actually dips a bit, which could be movement-based on Taros, but there's not a huge spike in overall damage here, mechanics aside. He spikes higher by about, I'd say, 20k when he gets power infusion, again at 420 towards the end of the fight. Now, a bit of that could be Soulfire damage with Execute, but nonetheless, Destro doesn't have that hit the button blast anymore. It's consistent damage, and once again, a lot of that just comes from Madness. You have to maintain this uptime on Madness. If you don't, your damage drops off considerably. Your damage is Chaos Bolt and it's Incinerate, based around Madness of the Ads, Cure Uptime, this guaranteeing max master benefit, and then Burn to Ashes. Now, comparatively, we can look at the Hunter in the raid here that bursts to 200k, and then sits somewhere around 85-ish, 90, but look at how many peaks and valleys they have. Like, a bit of a peak here at 110, valley. Peak here at 140, valley. Peak here again at 230, valley. Peak again at 305, valley. Peak, valley. And, like, while this is not as insane as other profiles have been in the past with cooldown usage on certain specs, if both specs can do essentially the same damage, one that can do these little incremental extra bursts or larger bursts with more cooldowns, more often than not will typically be brought to fights that have, once again, ad spawning, choke points, damage prio points, right? The Hunter is sustaining more here with more peaks and valleys, right? And let's pull up the actual Shaman here. Once again, look at these peaks and valleys. Not a 200k burst, didn't get power infusion, might not burst as high, but look at this. At what, 10 seconds in, 100 and probably 40k, a minute in, 140k, 2 minutes in, 105k, 230 in, 110k. This is a great example. 3 minutes in, 140k. Destro didn't break 100k again for the remainder of the fight. I mean, okay, maybe like once or twice here, but a profile like this, comparatively to a profile like this profile 9 times out of 10 whether they can allocate CDs or they're just better at doing damage in smaller bursts, if they both do the same amount of damage and there's no varying damage profiles needed for the fight, will 9 times out of 10 be brought to a fight because of the importance of cooldowns, where you can allocate them at certain points in a fight and push through that choke point in the fight if you're hitting a damage check or you need to kill more adds or break a shield. 9 times out of 10, specs like this that can do this damage while still maintaining overall a good amount of damage. He still did 85k over the course of the fight versus Destro doing 90k with 3 power infusions. More often than not having that extra button to push to get the extra damage through means that the spec ends up being a subpar choice compared to others that can do that in similar settings. I do think that when it comes to Destro's general lack of play, putting aside how underpowered Infernal is and other things here and there, lack of burst damage in certain settings and being more rampy with Rain of Fire, I think the biggest issue with Destro though, and the main reason why it's not being played in a lot of these settings is, number one, there weren't a crazy amount of fights this tier that fit Destro's damage profile very well, and I think a lot of that is due to Madness of the Azakir. And partially Madness, and also partially Destro's lack of mobility. Destro has really no spells that it can cast on the move. I mean, there's not even really there. The only spell Destro can cast on the move is Conflagrate, which is on an 8-ish, 8 to 10 second cooldown depending on haste, which you don't necessarily want to stack back to back because of Roaring Blaze uptime and min-maxing that. Outside of that, if you have a mechanic on you get to move for, you're just running and doing no damage. There are I mean, like literally Hover with Evokers gets 2 charges you can cast for 10 seconds. Icy Flows, Spirit Walker's Grace, every Hunter ability, right? There are classes in the game that have abilities they can hit, buttons they can press to allow them to cast in the move, whether it's Evokers with non-empowered spells, or Shamans, or Mages, or Hunters having every ability they can, under sun that they can cast in the move. Destro Lock suffers tremendously from Madness being a 5-second duration and having no button like Fell Flame, sort of like Kil'jaeden's Cunning. That's a bit excessive, but that you can't hit when you're moving. So there is that, and we'll go into a bit of gameplay here to look at it briefly. So we're gonna look at Madness. We're gonna look at Burned Ashes here as well. Now, there's 2 issues here. Madness, like I said, number one, Madness is a 5-second duration. It says 4, but it's 5. It was buffed to 5 at the end of beta. They never fixed the tooltip. It's 5 seconds. Number 2 is that Burned Ashes, you get 2 stacks of an Incinerate damage increase whenever you cast Chaos Bolt. Now, the problem, and also one of the reasons sort of why Crashing Chaos is not played, it's not very good in the first place, but also is that you get in these odd windows of, whether you're playing Crashing Chaos or not, where you're forced to cast one Chaos Bolt after another within 5 seconds of each other to get full benefit from Madness. So let's say, for example, Madness both reduces the cast time of Chaos Bolt and increases damage. So for example here, let me build some shards up here. We're going to cast a Chaos Bolt. So baseline Chaos Bolt cast time is 2.3 seconds. Madness reduced cast time is 1.6 seconds, right? So Madness checks for the cast time reduction on the next Chaos Bolt. It checks to see if the Madness buff is active when you begin casting the next Chaos Bolt, right? However, Madness checks for the damage increase part of Madness to Chaos Bolt upon Chaos Bolt resolution. So basically, what you have to do is, with Madness being a 5-second duration, you have to account for, okay, here's first bolt to apply Madness. You can then go Incinerate, but you can't Incinerate again because you'll get the cast time reduction, but you won't get the damage amp because the Madness buff from the first Chaos Bolt falls before second Chaos Bolt cast finishes. So now, realistically, that's a bit of a problem as well, because if you're factoring in movement on certain fights, like Kurog, like Taros, like Dathia, like every fight this tier, once again, Destro's great in single target sims, but it's not seeing really much play on Taros because there's a lot of movement on that fight. Having to maintain Madness while trying to weave in Burned Ashes stacks. For example, let's just open up here, right? So let's say I precast my Soulfire here. We're going in, put my Infernal down, Conflagrate, watch my shards here. So here's Madness duration, here's Burned Ashes, right? Now I want to dump Chaos Bolts, right? So I maintain Madness, keep getting the Chaos Bolt damage increase, cast time reduction. But at the same time, I'm just basically permanently capped at 3 to 4 stacks of Burned Ashes. I'm never going to dump these 4 stacks, barring getting bad Soul Conduit refunds, not getting any just procs in general. And that's just the world we live in. Now, once again, Burn to Ashes has been changed to 6 stacks max on PTR, but realistically, I'm capped here for days. Like, you never drop below 1 stack of Burn to Ashes, very, very rarely, if you have a bad sequence of RNG, no Soul Conduit refunds. So the 4 to 6 stack difference really doesn't change anything, but you're still in an odd spot of having to go, okay, I can, you know, I need to play around madness. So whether I'm going like, all right, we're gonna go Chaos Bolt, Incinerate, Conflagrate. I can't even go Soulfire into Bolt, because once again, I get the cast time reduction, I don't get the damage increase. So most of Locke's gameplay is very stationary. You have to go Chaos Bolt, Incinerate, and then like Bolt again. You can't go Chaos Bolt, Incinerate, dumping 2 stacks of Burn to Ashes, and then Bolt again, because Madness is falling for the damage amp. So it's this weird balancing act of trying to weave in Incinerates from Burn to Ashes, the balancing act of maintaining Madness being a 5-second debuff, while also getting a mechanic on you, trying and cast a Chaos Bolt or something on the move, dodging mechanics. There's a reason why Destro is a turret spec. There is no movement whatsoever. Or how did I word that? You can't do anything on the move. If you get a mechanic on you, have to move, you do 0 damage. Mages, hunters, shamans, evokers, every class in the game can cast abilities on the move. Destro can only cast Conflagrate, which you don't really even want to double stack if you can avoid it at times. So people ask, Destro sims so high, it sims so well, why is this thing no play in the raid? Because every single fight has a lot of movement on it, and it requires you to move, do mechanics. There's no stationary plant and just launch bolts forever kind of gameplay. If there was, Destro would be high, but there's not. And yet then, once again, you have to factor in Madness, factor in Burn to Ashes, and everything else. Now, there are solutions to this. Number one, I mean, obviously we can get some kind of movement-based ability. People always say Kill Jaden's Cunning. I'm not against Kill Jaden's Cunning. I think one of the older versions of Kill Jaden's Cunning is very similar to Spirit Walker's Grace now, where it was a cooldown. I think it was a minute or 2 long. You pop it, you can cast in the move. Similar to Spirit Walker's Grace, similar to Hover. That wouldn't be too bad. The OG version was too strong and won't come back. But realistically, it would be an okay option. Other option people point out a lot is Fell Flame, having that as an ability to cast in the move. But that doesn't really help with Madness buff uptime, right? Now, I think that Fell Flame and or KJC would be great to come back. I don't know how realistic it is, but at the same time, people just say, okay, a simple solution to Madness, make the duration longer. And I'm not against that. It's already 5 seconds. But the thing is that if you made the duration, let's say 7 seconds up from 5, that would easily make it so you can go in Chaos Bolt, Incinerate, Conflagrate, Chaos Bolt, right? You could weave in more Incinerates, which means you're dumping more stacks of Burn to Ashes, so there's less like overcapping on BTA, but at the same time, Madness then becomes basically a permanent buff. You're casting at least 1 Chaos Bolt every 7 seconds, and I feel like from a class design standpoint, Blizzard would not like that, because it goes from being this buff you gotta watch every once in a while, like Dread Touch, to being it's mostly passive. You just cast Chaos Bolts, and that's that. Another solution, just replace Madness, but at the same time, Madness is a very large portion of our profile. Chaos Bolt, Rain of Fire, both benefit substantially from Madness, especially pairing Madness with Chaos Incarnate. So I'm really not sure of a great solution outside of giving Warlock some spell they can cast in the move. Once again, like Fell Flame, you can make Incinerate castable on the move, which is what KJC used to do. That would be great. I wouldn't mind that, but something needs to be done, because Destro's getting buffed multiple times over the course. It's happened over this patch in 10.0 and 10.0.5. It's getting buffed again in 10.0.7. It's already simming high enough. It's not a damage issue. It's a mechanical issue. There's 0 movement. You can't move with this class. It's a stationary turret. Its cleave is not as good as it may seem. And its AoE is just lacking when it comes to that on-demand burst you want. Our AoE is insane when you can ramp for a while, but there hasn't been a raid fight in a very long time where you sit there and you spam, AoE for a minute or so, unless Primal Council, sure, that's whatever, right? There's really hasn't been a fight in a long time where you can sit there and spam AoE based abilities and get insane value like Destro can with Inferno. There just hasn't been one. So that's also something that needs to be addressed, because Destro's snap on-demand burst AoE, it's just not there. There's a reason why it's seeing very little play in most fights in this raid, and it's a mix of those issues. It's not a raw damage issue. All right, so to wrap up basically everything that I talked about in this video, summary wise, number one, Destro's AoE is an issue at times. Now, it lacks on-demand burst AoE and struggles in those 3, 4, 5, 6, even 7+ target settings at times, right? If you're playing the big AoE build with Inferno and pulling 10, 12, 14 mobs in each pack, Destro is insane. It's very, very good. It's why I see he's playing the MDI in those settings. Is it seeing play in Halls of Valor in the less dense dungeons? Typically not. And your only options in those 4, 5, 6 target settings are to play like Cry Havoc Chaos Bolt play, which is just subpar, or maybe opt for like Cataclysm, but Cata's not even that great when it comes to on-demand burst AoE. It's great for the class's toolkit. I'd love to see Cataclysm go like put Rain of Fire, put it Inferno, and put Cataclysm here. Pyrogenics is terrible. No one cares about this. Get it out of here. Make it Rain of Fire, Inferno, Cata, or go Cata, Inferno, Rain of Fire. It doesn't matter. But either way, even if you made Cata baseline or not share a choice node, the problem is Destro still lacks in those 3 to 4, 5, 6 target settings. Just Rain of Fire, it doesn't do a whole lot until you hit a larger target amount where you're generating a bunch of shards and casting multiple Rain of Fires. I don't have a great solution to that. It's just sort of a general design kind of thing, but that's worth highlighting. Number 2, Infernal as a cooldown is underpowered in single target, even in raiding at times. It needs to be buffed, or realistically, the talents below it, being Crushing Chaos, Infernal Brand, GWD, and Reign of Chaos, need to be buffed. Realistically, make GWD a class tree thing so you can have 2-minute Infernal and not 3-minute Infernal. 2-minute Infernal and 3-minute Infernal Destro are two different specs entirely. Memes aside, they feel very, very different, having that large Infernal every 2 minutes versus every 3. And a class that can bring cooldowns every 2 versus 3 is better in a plethora of settings, right? Either way, if it stays 3 minutes and this stays here, these need to be buffed or overhauled, because Infernal at this current point in time, it's very cool, the ability, but it does very low damage, as we saw in the logs. Number 3, Madness is too restrictive and promotes stationary gameplay. The 5-second window on Madness is too restrictive. In the majority of raid encounters we have in Vault of the Incarnates, it's spelled wrong. It is too restrictive in basically every setting that we have in Vault of the Incarnates. If you can stand still and plant and turret, Madness is great. You can do a lot of damage, but factoring in movement and things when it comes to the Chaos Bolt portion does indeed make Destro stationary. And if you have to move with mechanics, maintaining Madness on the move is basically impossible, depending on how long you have to kite the mechanic out, right? So I don't know if the solution is increasing Madness's duration. It would be a great fix to it, but it makes it sort of a passive and like just always active buff. If Blizzard's okay with that, please do it. Make it 7 seconds, 8 seconds. That'd be great. Which sort of leads into the Burn to Ashes thing here, because once again, casting multiple bolts back to back, which you're sort of told to do via Madness, means you're capping out on Burn to Ashes stacks. So that's awkward as well. That probably needs to be looked at. The 6 stack increase in 0.7 really doesn't do a whole lot there, because you never drop below 1 stack anyways of Burn to Ashes. And the big thing I want to drive home here as well, which could sort of fix a lot of this stuff, is that Destro has nothing you can cast in the move. We mentioned once again Hover for Evokers, Icy Flows for Mages, Shamans have Spirit Walker's Grace, Hunters can cast everything on the move, and honestly most classes, basically every spec has something you can cast in the move. Destro simply has Conflict Rate, which you don't really want to cast back to back multiple times due to Roaring Blaze. You can and you will if you have to, but it's not great. Besides that, you have nothing you can cast in the move. You can't cast a single spell. You are AFK if you have to move for mechanics, right? Which greatly hurts Destro. Kill Jaden's Cunning was a spell back in the day. The more nerfed version that was a cooldown, like Spirit Walker's Grace, could come back, could be relevant. That would help Destro a lot on movement-based fights, make it much better in those settings. To a similar extent, like we talked about Fell Flame, a spell you can cast in the move that gives you shards for Destro, partial shards, whatever have you, could also be great. That would also help a whole lot. It wouldn't help you leverage Madness uptime in the move, which might be the way they want to go with it, but Destro needs something when it comes to movement, because in its current form, it sims really well. The spec has a lot of great tools. I mean, you've got Havoc, Flashpoint, Rolling Havoc, you've got Backlash back, Embers, Madness, Chaos Incarnate, Inferno. You've got all these cool abilities that are very, very cool. The spec's a Swiss Army knife. It sort of can do a lot of things, potentially, but the movement's a huge issue that disrupts all of that due to Madness. And I guess it can't snap on-demand burst AoE, you know, and it can't put out big damage because Dark Soul's gone. But it's still very customizable. But regardless, it's received multiple buffs in 10.0, in 10.0.5, in 10.0.7, and I'd assume in 10.1. But the issue is not damage for Destro. The issue is fundamentally at its core, its toolkit with madness and its lack of mobility is what causes Destro gameplay to be subpar, and the main reason why it's dead last in both the Incarnates, even though it sims as one of the highest specs in the game. So that should finally wrap it up. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm sorry the video ran a bit long. I felt like there was a handful of things I wanted to hit on. It might have seemed a little long, but honestly, I think there's just a handful of things that that Destro really needs to have looked at in 10.1. I mean, the changes that are coming in 0.7 are, I mean, they're buffs. They're buffs to Incinerate, but realistically, like I said, I don't think Destro needs more buffs. I think I mean, sure, in burst AoE, but once again, it's burst AoE. That's more of a general mechanical toolkit issue. We don't have a spell that can do that, right? To a similar extent, we have no spell we can cast in the move. And also, if Madness falls, well, our damage falls a lot too. If you look at most raid encounters nowadays, there really aren't many just plant, stand still, and blast the boss down without moving kind of fights anymore. So while I like Madness, while it's great with Rain of Fire and Inferno spam, while Destro Lock is very good in those high-end, huge Rain of Fire spam settings in the MDI, there's a reason it is dead last in the raid, and that is because, once again, no mobility, no snap on-demand burst AoE, and just being subpar when it comes to any kind of movement-based fight, which is literally every single fight in this raid. So we'll see where it goes. I wanted to make this video for a few weeks now and highlight Destro's weak points. I feel like we did a good job in the feedback for 0.1, but I don't know. We'll see. I want a stronger Infernal. I don't know if we're getting back Dark Soul. It'd be nice, but I think the toolkit is sort of there with some tweaks and things potentially. I realistically, I'd love KJC back. Bring back Fell Flame. That'd be sick. I don't think it's too far outside the question at this point because, I mean, KJC was a little strong back in the day when you can cast permanently on the move, but if you made it a cooldown like how Spirit Walker's Grace is, it will be fine. We don't need permanent cast in the move whenever we want kind of thing anymore. Most of the fights are pre-planned movement. You can pop KJC if it has 2 stacks and basically make Destro mobile. And it still wouldn't be... It might even take a bit of retuning for Destro. It might be strong enough. It might be too strong in certain settings. Who knows? But either way, it's very, very easy to buff or nerf classes, right? If a class is performing too poor in damage, buff it. If it's too good, you can nerf it. But getting like core fundamental spec changes like Madness or like getting Fell Flame added to the talent tree or getting KJC, those are harder to do. But I do think that Destro will suffer the same fate it has in Vault of the Incarnates in 10.1 and in 10.2 unless there are fights that are structured to be much more range friendly, much more just stationary gameplay friendly, because not much is changing. You can sim for an insane amount of damage, but if you can't effectively deal that damage due to mechanics or the way your spec functions in most raid settings, it doesn't matter. That's why Demo sim most playing in the raid, and Demo sims for 20,000 less DPS, literally 15k in single target than what Destro does for me. Varying damage profiles, but it can also cast spells in the move. You're not maintaining a buff for every. You're not maintaining Madness. You're just casting spells, moving, and we'll see where it goes. But I don't want to ramble too much. TLDR. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, weak wars, add-ons, profiles down below. On Twitch and Discord, links to both those on there, all for free. And also before we end, as always, one big shout out on my patrons. Guys, thank you for supporting on Patreon 10,000 times. As always, I really appreciate it. If you're looking at supporting on Patreon, it should be a link up here as well as down below. And yeah, so I don't want this video to seem like I'm rambling about how bad Destro is, because don't get me wrong, I think with a few minor changes like to Madness, maybe to Burn to Ashes, wouldn't mind some Infernal changes, and or KJC movement stuff, Fell Flame, Destro can have a very good toolkit. It already has one. It's just sort of lacking. It feels like I don't have a good analogy for it. It feels like we're close to having a really good spec. We already sim very high. We don't need more buffs. What we need are just core fundamental mechanical / toolkit fixes. And hopefully with what I'm assuming is 10.1 PTR on the horizon in the next few weeks, we'll get them. So with that being said, thanks for watching, guys. If you like the video, smash the like and sub buttons below. Helps out a ton. And I'll catch you all again soon on stream. Peace.